सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Welcome back to this week's first edition of ThePrint Security Code. ThePrint's reputation for granular on-ground journalism and in-depth analysis have won it the support of viewers like you. But good journalism costs money, and that means we need viewers like you to subscribe. Please do consider taking a subscription. The link is in the description below. And how is it that emerald puts out the eyes of snakes? To the 9th century theologian Ibn al-Rawandi, it seemed that the light that had illuminated the lives of his people for 3 centuries was actually blinding them to reality. The philosopher deluged Islamic clerics with questions about the truth of prophecy, the contradictions in passages of the Quran, and the illogic of religious rituals. The human race, he argued, had not needed the help of divine revelation to map the movements of the stars, nor to fashion sheep gut and wood into lutes. Furious contemporaries denounced al-Rawandi and declared him a heretic. The conservative polemicist Ibn al-Jawzi, scholar Sarah Stromza records, declared al-Rawandi was worse than the devil because while Iblis defied God, he at least had the decency to address him with some respect. On 30th June, in a gesture that blurred the lines between agitprop and teenage tantrum, the obscure Iraqi-born Christian refugee Salvan Momika set fire to the Quran in Sweden. In interviews, Momika claimed to be protecting his new homeland from Islam. His critics have noted that Momika in the past allied with the same religious extremists he now denounces. The furious response has led many countries to consider if free speech is worth the price. In Sweden itself, some are arguing for a scrapped 1970 law that criminalized the burning of religious texts to be brought back. Even though it might seem expedient in the face of religious rage though, reintroducing blasphemy laws would hack at the foundations of liberal principles that protect us all. Like Kanhaiyalal Teli, who was brutally murdered for posting a video on social media with purportedly blasphemous content, Salvan Momika might not be a free speech crusader or a role model, but defending his right to express his opinion should concern us all. For more than a decade now, the member states of the Organisation of the Islamic Conference have been periodically lobbying for blasphemy to be made a global offence. The OIC argues that the reforms it seeks are linked in some way to hate speech proscription. That is, they want the protections enjoyed by vulnerable religious or ethnic minorities to religions as a whole. Free speech supporters have been unimpressed by this argument. Flogging and imprisoning people who speak disrespectfully about religion is not a move towards tolerance, observes journalist Nicholas Goldenberg. The same OIC governments that want blasphemy criminalized, scholar Paul Marshall notes, have resisted enforcing international norms against egregious violations of human rights which are purported to be based on Islamic law, like amputation or execution. Even the Taliban's war on women, which has evicted them from schools and workplaces, has been handled with great tenderness by the OIC. Little imagination is needed to see that ideologically bankrupt regimes hope to profit by positioning themselves as guardians of Islam. In Pakistan, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif organized a day of protest against the burning of the Quran in Sweden, joined, perhaps ironically, by the opposition Tehreek-e-Insaf, who can agree with the government on nothing else. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan promised to, and I quote, teach the arrogant Westerners that insulting Muslims is not freedom of thought. Morocco and Jordan recalled their ambassadors to Sweden, while Saudi Arabia issued a stern diplomatic reprimand. This kind of language helps government ward off jihadist opposition. Iraqi mobs, after all, stormed the Swedish embassy in Baghdad, Al-Qaeda called for blasphemers to be beheaded, and the Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan described the Quran burning as, I quote, an act of war. The powerful Tehreek-e-Tahaffuz Namus-e-Risalat anti-blasphemy movement in Pakistan has called for, and I quote, the spirit of jihad to be rekindled by this incident. From the case of Pakistan, which saw its first blasphemy killing 75 years ago, it is clear that the government's use of blasphemy laws has only served to empower religious extremists. After all, they're more powerful than they were so many decades ago. In India, similarly, harsh laws against causing religious offense to Group A or Group B have served to encourage violence and competitive communalism. All gods rest on the corpses of earlier ones. In 630 CE, so chroniclers recorded, the warrior Khalid ibn al-Walid entered the temple at Nakhla, where the tribes of Quraysh and Kinana worshipped Al-Uzza. Al-Walid was, chroniclers claim, confronted by a naked, wild-haired Abyssinian woman who cut down 9 of his men before she was overpowered and chopped in two. That was Al-Uzza, the Prophet Muhammad reputedly told his general, and never again shall she be worshipped in your land. For the most part, though, state violence was not actually unleashed against freethinkers in the early years of Islam. Al-Rawandi and the great polymath Abu Bakr al-Razi could write fearlessly and don't seem to have lived in any danger of their lives. Like other medieval religious systems, the scholar Christine Amies has shown, Islamic regimes became increasingly concerned with heresy and apostasy as polities became more complex and the state expanded. In the early Muslim community, knowing who belonged and who didn't was a simple issue. As it expanded and wielded state power, though, orthodoxy had to be enforced. You needed rules. The 7th century caliphate of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan infamously crucified the preacher Al-Harith bin Sa'id, who claimed to have been the recipient of prophetic revelations himself. The crucifixion, historian Sean Anthony, however, notes, only emerged as a subject of historical interest centuries later. Enforcement of orthodoxy reached its heights under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid al-Mamun, wrote Ames, who rose to the throne in Baghdad in 813 CE, under the shadow of a civil war with his predecessor and brother. The war against heresy would involve the macabre execution of the Sufi Mansur al-Hallaj, who was allegedly beaten, then placed in a pillory, his hands and feet cut off, before he was finally mercifully decapitated. Arrest, interrogation, book burning, social exclusion. The tools of the Muslim inquisitor were of course remarkably similar to those of the Christians. Ibn Hatim al-Tulaytuli, for example, was tried for heresy in Toledo in 1064 and executed by crucifixion. To the east, the Caliph Al-Qadir relentlessly persecuted the rationalist Mutazilites, promoting instead his own traditionalism. The followers of Muhammad ibn Karam, hostile to commerce and embracing a culture of voluntary poverty, were also persecuted as heretics. The chronicler Mansur al-Baghdadi, Amies notes, complained that the Karamiya had, I quote, introduced stupidities without precedent. What stupidities? Among them, forbidding prayer in dirty clothes and on dirty ground and with a dirty body. For much of the 20th century, debates over heresy in the Middle East took a form more familiar to us, as doddering monarchies and their puppet clerics gave way to modern ideological movements. Liberal democracies, though, were conspicuous by their absence in the region. Ferocious contests pitted various groups of nationalists, communists, and increasingly Islamists against each other. Large-scale slaughter is today associated with jihadist or Islamist movements. But the slaughter of between 5,000 and 25,000 people at Hama at the hands of the secular nationalist regime of Hafiz al-Assad made the stakes clear to the Islamists. Egyptian Islamist theologian Yusuf al-Qaradawi, among the ideological fountains of the modern jihadist movement, was himself a survivor of torture at the hands of Egypt's socialist regime. He argued that, I quote, "Apostasy is never just an intellectual stance, it also entails a change of allegiance, an exchange of identity, and a transformation of belonging." In other words, the apostate, Qaradawi thus argued, cuts himself off from the community of Islam of which he was a member, and with his mind and heart will join its enemies. Iran's former theocratic ruler Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini successfully used blasphemy as a political weapon, seizing Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses to represent himself as the defender of Islam against a predatory West. The philosopher Kenan Malik has shown how the war against the book powered a struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia for power amongst Islamic diasporas in the West and beyond. The bloody fallout from the Charlie Hebdo cartoons or Terry Jones's burning of the Quran in Florida has led many to question if free speech is really worth the violence. In 1766, François-Jean de la Barre, tortured, beheaded, and burnt with a copy of Voltaire's philosophical dictionary nailed to his torso, became the last French victim of blasphemy. He was charged with failing to doff his hat to a religious procession. Today, he is remembered by a statue erected in his memory at the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur in Paris. That statue is a reminder of the huge price that has been paid to build societies where people can speak their minds freely. We shouldn't give up those rights without a fight. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint. Thank you again for watching this week's first edition of Security Code.